where palsy, like you've heard of cerebral palsy, shakes a few sad last gray hairs, where youth grows pale and spectre thin and dies, where but to think is to be full of sorrow and leaden-eyed despairs. Oh my gosh, it's so depressing. But if you've ever been to a nursing home for service hours, or you have a loved one there, you know how you might walk by a room and there's just moaning, you know, and it can be really out of your comfort zones if you're not accustomed to it, or lots of shaking, you know. So he gives us this picture of shaking so hard it's actually shaking out the few last gray hairs on a body. And he is maybe accustomed to that end for old people, but he's young. And so he goes there when he says about youth grows pale and spectre thin and dies. So that's all this is, just trying to come to terms with knowing he's going to die young. Stanza 4. Away, away, I will fly to thee, bird, not charioted by Bacchus and his pards, but on the viewless wings of Poesy. Have you ever heard of Bacchus?
Yes.
Do you know what he's the god of? Wine. And those of you that have been to Rome may have actually seen at the Vatican museums, you may have seen statues of Bacchus. You can always tell because he's got loads of grapes with him because he's the god of wine. He is depicted as being drawn in a chariot pulled by leopards. Okay, so when it says not charioted by Bacchus and his pards, it means not pulled by chariot by leopards. That's the pards. So if he says, I'm not going to fly to you charioted by Bacchus and his pards, he just decided not to do what? He's not going to get drunk. He's like, I think that would be short-lived. It would be a temporary problem solver, not a long problem solver. So he's like, I'm not going to drink. Rather, I'm going to escape on the viewless wings of Poesy. Underline that. It's a really important line. Poesy here is poetry. Viewless would be invisible. So I'm not going to escape through the use of alcohol. I am going to escape on the imaginary, or not imaginary, invisible wings of poetry. What in the world? How would you escape your problems through poetry? Writing. Writing is therapy. Writing can be very therapeutic. In fact, we've had some students who, in their therapy, they actually had to journal because it's healthy. So, like 2 thumbs up for Keats because he decided not to indulge in alcohol, rather write about his problems. Hey, that's a way healthier outlet. He's not going to get into much trouble in that, right? So, really he's talking about in his imagination. As he's writing, he can create fictional worlds. And you see one on the screen here. He's kind of creating these scenes where he can get lost in that. And maybe that has more longevity than drunkenness. Okay, just write, create. If you've ever been lost in a book, you understand what that feels like, to be able to go to a different world and forget about your problems for a while just by reading. So reading and writing, that's just what English teachers like to hear. So now he goes into his imagination as he describes, tender is the night, and happily the queen moon is on her throne, clustered around by all her starry fays. But here there is no light save what from heaven is with the breezes blown through verdurous glooms and winding mossy ways. So the picture he's painting is a moon and stars. This is what he sees. And how in a heavily woodsy, forested area, you would just get drips of that moonlight coming through the trees. Right? It's not very bright, but kind of speckled. It's a very romantic scene. But he decides that he will describe the moon as He sees her as the queen, and all the stars are her surrounding fairies in this woodsy area. So he's getting lost in that imagination. This is his escape. In stanza 5, maybe we'll just address B more specifically on the top of the next page. Are you having difficulty answering these questions as we go? Or you're following?
Just the last one.
Okay, that last one says, how are the heavens contrasted with the earth? Okay, he talks about, say, what from heaven is but here there is no light, save what from heaven is with the breezes blown. You know how I said the light is barely trickling through the trees? He sees the earth that way, like it's mostly dark at night with a few glimmers of moonlight coming through the trees. But the heavens are all light. So I see a little bit of spiritual symbolism there. That not just the earthly heavens, but heaven is light. Earth is dark. But we still get little glimmers of it here and there. Those moments when we're like, oh, I feel Jesus, Those are the little rays of light that we get on earth to let us know of what is to come. Did Keats share that perspective? I don't know. Yes.
Were the romantic poets usually Christian?
She asked, were the romantics usually Christians? Not always. I actually can only think of one that I'm confident he was a Christian. The other 5 who are really famous really looked to nature as the divine. They failed to connect what's beautiful in nature to Creator God. So that's kind of sad. Keats, I don't know, but William Wordsworth for sure. He went to church, he's buried behind a church, but in studying him, scholars tell me he just didn't make the connection to God at all. It was just nature. So I always kind of ache for them a little bit because I'm like, you were so close. Like they were onto something really powerful, but just didn't take it to that next level. They thought it was nature that did all this. Stanza 5. I cannot see what flowers are at my feet, nor what soft incense hangs upon the boughs, but in embalmed darkness guess each sweet, wherewith the seasonable month endows. Now, this is more of that synesthesia that I was telling you about. What do you think, what sense do you associate with incense? Smell. But he describes it, I cannot see what soft incense hangs upon the boughs. So he can't see it, and he describes it as soft, which is a touch thing. He also says, I can't see what flowers are at my feet, but in embalmed darkness. So it's like everything's dark and he can smell things that he can't see, and he can touch things that he should be able to smell. It's a mixture of all the senses. Why? Because he's getting lost in imagination, as I told you. And I also think that he's under this tree writing this poem. I think he's kind of dozing in and out, like a little bit of nappy time. Then he wakes up and writes a few lines. So he might very well have his eyes closed, and he's like, I can't see the flowers, but I can smell the flowers. He's listening to the bird song. It's dark, but the scent, the fragrance from the tree, he's catching on to. Number 6, stanza 6. Darkling, he's talking to the bird, I listen. For many a time I have been half in love with easeful death, called him soft names in many a mused rhyme, to take into the air my quiet breath. Now more than ever seems it rich to die, to cease upon the midnight with no pain, while thou art pouring forth thy soul abroad in such an ecstasy. How would he like to die? Easily. He would actually rather die right here, right now, than have to endure years of suffering and the slow decline of his body. If he could just die right here under the tree, listening to the sound of the bird, he would be in love with that idea. Just death take me now, because he knows the suffering that is coming. Then he ends that stanza with, still wouldest thou sing, and I have ears in vain, to thy high requiem become aside. Now a requiem would be like a song sung at a funeral. So he's like, too bad the bird would be singing, but I would be buried under the sod, under the earth, so I could no longer hear the funeral song. So morbid. Next stanza. Thou wast not born for death, immortal bird. No hungry generations tread thee down. The voice I hear this passing night was heard in ancient days by emperor and clown. Perhaps the self-same song that found a path through the sad heart of Ruth, when sick for home she stood in tears amid the alien corn. He's talking about the bird song, the song of the nightingale, right? But he says it was the same song that generations have heard. The same song that in ancient days the emperor and the emperor's clown, the court jester, may have heard. How could he be listening to the same song that they heard in ancient days? It's the same type of bird. The nightingale, for as long as the nightingale has lived, singing the same song. So it's not this exact same bird, but it's the same song. The reason this is important is because he starts to feel a connectedness with everyone who has gone before. Because everyone in ancient times shares one similar trait with him, at least. What is it? Yes, they could have heard the song, but death, right? Every past person has died. And so when, you know how he said earlier in the other poem, he stood on the edge of the world feeling very alone? This is a bit of an epiphany, where maybe he doesn't feel quite so alone because everyone who has gone before him has also died. He thought he was in it all by himself, but maybe not. It's even the same sad song that Ruth heard. Who's Ruth? From the Bible. This is a biblical allusion, a reference to someone that we already have some familiarity with. So he's like, maybe even Ruth out there working in the fields for Boaz, maybe she heard this same song. So a feeling of connectedness with everyone who has gone before. And then he falls back into that imagination with the magic casements, their windows opening on the foam of perilous seas in fairylands forlorn. So there's a ship in fairylands. Magic, it's part of that imagination. But when he says fairylands forlorn, it's like a jolt back to reality. Forlorn, it wakes him up. It's like if you're completely asleep on the couch and something happens, an alarm goes off, there's a knock on the door, your dog barks, and it just yanks you awake. That's what happened. He's kind of been in this dreamy, hazy imagination, but forlorn, he says, is the very word is like a bell to toll me back from thee, bird, to my soul self. So he concludes with adieu. What does adieu mean? Bye. The fancy or imagination, circle fancy and write in imagination, cannot cheat so well as she is famed to do, deceiving elf. Important line. The imagination cannot cheat as well as she is famed to do. So he had decided he wasn't going to escape through alcohol. He was going to escape through his imagination, but it turns out imagination isn't that great either, because eventually he snaps out of it. It's back to reality, same old sorrows, same pain, same sickness. So it didn't extend much longer than the alcohol, but still safer option. Then he talks about the sound of the bird. It's gone over the next valley glades. Then he's like, was it a vision or a waking dream? Fled is that music. Do I wake or sleep? That really dizzying, trying to wake up but still half in a coma. That's how he concludes. Were you able to answer all the questions? Or are there any you want to revisit? Sorry, 6B. So if he died, he would be buried under the ground and could no longer hear the sound of the bird. So that was kind of the negative too. I'd like to die here and now listening to the bird song, but then if I was dead, I couldn't hear the bird song. Yes, ma'am.
On stanza 7, what is the version?
Probably hope, imagination. It just flies over the hillside and he's back to his sorrows. Anything else? Okay. Andrew, can you click stop on there for me?